in a move that has significantly escalated the political and diplomatic stakes of his forthcoming summit with Russian President Vladimir Putin. United States President Donald Trump has made a powerful and unexpected public promise that he will actively work to negotiate the return of Ukrainian territories currently under Russian military control. This declaration, a direct and forceful statement of intent, appears to tackle the single most difficult and emotional issue at the heart of the devastating war. The announcement has created shockwaves around the globe, prompting a wide and varied range of interpretations. On one level, the statement seems to be a calculated maneuver to calm the rising tide of criticism and deep-seated anxiety, particularly from Ukrainian officials and their allies across Europe, who have feared that President Trump's well-known transactional and deal-focused approach to diplomacy might lead him to formally legitimize Russia's existing territorial seizures in exchange for rapid cessations of hostilities. By casting himself in the role of a champion who will actively fight to restore Ukraine's lost land, President Trump is projecting an image of unwavering strength and firm resolve, publicly aligning himself with one of Kyiv's most fundamental war aims. However, this ambitious promise simultaneously established an extraordinarily high and difficult benchmark for what would constitute a successful outcome for the Alaska summit. It also places him on a direct and unavoidable collision course with the Kremlin's deeply and legally entrenched position that these territories are now sovereign parts of Russia. This declaration has therefore injected a potent and unpredictable new element into the delicate pre-summit diplomacy, leaving allies, adversaries, and observers worldwide to speculate whether this represents a genuine and non-negotiable policy objective, a clever strategic negotiating tactic to gain leverage, or a public relations gesture designed to afford him the greatest possible political flexibilities depending on the outcome of the talk. The deliberate ambiguity of the promise, particularly the meaning of the word try and the unspecified amount of territory he is referring to, only deepens the profound uncertainty that now envelopes the impending meeting. The practical challenge of making good on such a promise is, by any objective measure, simply monumental. It verges on the impossible when viewed against the backdrop of current political and legal realities. The Kremlin does not view its control over Ukrainian land as a temporary military occupation or as a mere bargaining chip for future negotiations. It has formally and in its own legal and political framework irrevocably absorbed these territories into the constitutional body of the Russian Federation. This process of annexation began with the military seizure and subsequent absorption of the Crimean Peninsula in 2014. It was followed in 2022 by the widely condemned and internationally unrecognized annexation of 4 additional Ukrainian regions: Donetsk, Luhansk, Kherson, and Zaporizhia. These were not simply political decrees. They were followed by the formal amendments of the Russian constitution itself, which now explicitly names these Ukrainian regions as constituent subjects and integral parts of the Russian Federation. From the strict perspective of Russian domestic law and the powerful forces of Russian nationalism, the act of ceding any of this land would be equivalent to giving away sovereign Russian territory itself. Such an act would be politically unthinkable and likely suicidal for any Russian leader, including the powerful and deeply entrenched Vladimir Putin. President Putin has invested an immense amount of his personal political capital and Russia's national prestige in what he terms the reunification of these lands with their historical motherland. He has successfully framed this expansionist project to his domestic audience as the righteous correction of a historical injustice and as a core element of Russia's resurgent national identity and destiny. For him to abruptly reverse this course would be to admit to a strategic failure of epic proportion, an action that would completely undermine the primary justification for a brutal and costly war that has exacted a heavy price from Russia in both blood and national treasure. Consequently, President Trump's pledge to get back territory is not a straightforward matter of negotiating a phased withdrawal of military force from a contested combat zone. It is, in effect, a direct demand that the Russian Federation fundamentally alter its own constitutional order, repudiate its own law, and abandon a core tenet of its current national self-concept. This is a demand that officials in Moscow have repeatedly and emphatically rejected out of hands as an impossible and absurd precondition for any form of negotiation. This unyielding Russian intransigence is met with an equally firm, resolute, and emotionally charged positions on the Ukrainian side. President Volodymyr Zelensky, his government, and the overwhelming majority of the Ukrainian people have remained absolutely consistent in their stance that a just, fair, and sustainable peace is utterly impossible without the complete and unconditional restoration of Ukraine's sovereignty over all of its territory as defined by its internationally recognized 1991 borders. This non-negotiable demand includes not only the lands that have been seized by Russia since the full-scale invasion began in 2022, but also the entire Crimean Peninsula. This position is not merely a statement of government policy that can be easily amended. It has evolved into a profound national consensus, one that has been forged and hardened in the fires of a brutal war of national survival. For the vast majority of ordinary Ukrainians, the idea of compromising on territory would mean validating Russia's savage aggression and accepting the permanent dismemberment of their nation. It would be universally seen as a profound betrayal of the tens of thousands of soldiers and civilians who have sacrificed their lives and well-being in the defense of their homeland's freedom and integrity. President Zelensky has gone so far as to state that any proposal involving a fundamental change to Ukraine's border could only be decided by the Ukrainian people themselves through a national referendum. Under the current circumstance of patriotic fervor and national unity against the aggressor, such a vote would almost certainly result in an overwhelming rejection of any deal involving territorial concessions. As a result, President Trump has effectively placed himself between two seemingly immovable objects: a Russian government that is constitutionally prohibited from relinquishing the territory it has annexed, and a Ukrainian nation that is morally, politically, and emotionally bound to reclaim it. His promise to get land back for Ukraine while appearing to satisfy Kyiv's demand completely disregard the formidable political and legal realities that exist in Moscow, thereby creating a fundamental and perhaps fatal contradiction at the very heart of his declared negotiating stance. The critical question that arises from this diplomatic puzzle is what possible strategy President Trump could realistically employ to bridge this vast and seemingly unbridgeable chasm. Based on his past performance in high-stakes negotiations and his frequent public statements, his approach would likely be a dynamic and aggressive combination of immense pressure and highly tempting incentives, a high-stakes geopolitical game of carrot and stick. The stick portion of his strategy would involve leveraging the unparalleled military and economic power of the United States to inflict maximum pain on Russia. Under the guidance of his Secretary of Defense, Peter Hegseth, President Trump could threaten to not just continue, but to dramatically escalate the level and sophistication of weaponry provided to Ukraine. This could involve supplying Kyiv with more advanced long-range missile systems that could allow them to strike with greater precision and at greater depth into Russian-held territories, thereby increasing the daily cost of occupation. Such a move would aim to raise the price of the war for Russia to a politically and economically unsustainable level, forcing President Putin to reconsider the value of holding onto every inch of captured land. On the economic front, President Trump could threaten a new and even more debilitating waves of sanctions. This could be designed by his Secretary of the Treasury, Scott Bessent, and Secretary of Commerce, Howard Lutnick, to target Russia's vital energy sector more directly or to implement punishing secondary sanctions on any nations or company that continues to trade with Moscow, effectively isolating Russia from the global economy. The carrot, conversely, would need to be exceptionally appealing to persuade President Putin to even contemplate such a historic and politically risky reversal. This is where the diplomatic skills of Secretary of State Marco Rubio would come into play. President Trump could propose a comprehensive grand bargain that addressed some of Russia's longest-held security concerns. A central element of this could be a formal, legally binding guarantee that Ukraine would not be granted membership in the NATO military alliance. He demanded that Russia has cited as a reason for the conflict. The deal could be expanded to include broader negotiations on a new security framework for all of Europe, potentially with verifiable limits on missile deployments and the scale of military exercise, which could provide Russia with a greater sense of security on its western flank. Another enormously powerful incentive would be the phased but complete lifting of all existing economic sanctions, a move that would unlock vast resources for the struggling Russian economy and provide a significant boost to President Putin's domestic standing. President Trump might even offer Putin a pathway back to international respectability, suggesting a full reset of diplomatic relations with the West and Russia's potential return to influential international forum. In a sense, Trump's high-stakes gamble would be that he can construct a package of benefits so overwhelmingly positive that it would provide President Putin with enough political cover to portray a territorial withdrawal to his domestic audience not as a humiliating defeat, but as a brilliant strategic victory that secures Russia's most vital national security interests and end its painful international isolation. The international response to President Trump's bold pledge has been a predictable and revealing mix of cautious public endorsement and profound private skepticism. In Kyiv, government officials have little choice but to publicly welcome any statements from a United States president that appear to support their claim to all their territory. It served as a valuable moral boost for the public and the military and strengthened their own state negotiating position. Behind the official statements, however, there is a deep well of anxiety. Ukrainian leaders have long been wary of President Trump's transactional America First approach and his previous rhetoric about ending the war quickly. They harbor a significant fear that his promise to try to get territory back is merely a rhetorical opening that could lead to a negotiation where he ultimately pressured them to accept a partial return of land, perhaps the territory seized since 2022, in exchange for permanently relinquishing any claims to Crimea. Such a land for peace deal would still leave their nation dismembered and would be viewed by the Ukrainian public as an unacceptable and treacherous compromise. The recent severe battlefield setback, including the Russian breakthrough near the city of Prokhorovsk, only served to make Ukraine's negotiating position more precarious, increasing its dependence on American support and, by extension, its vulnerability to American pressure. In the major European capitals of London, Paris, and Berlin, the reaction is one of widespread and profound doubt. European leaders who have committed significant political and financial capital to supporting Ukraine and maintaining a united Western front against Russian aggression view President Trump's unilateral and grandiose declaration with considerable unease. They largely see it as an unrealistic promise that is almost certain to fail. This failure, they fear, could lead to a frustrated President Trump who might then impulsively cut off vital aid to Ukraine or seek a separate, more limited deal with Putin that fundamentally undermine European security. They are deeply concerned that this highly personal, high-profile pledge completely sidelines the patient, multilateral diplomatic processes that they have been painstakingly trying to construct. There is a strong and widely held belief in Europe that the only viable and sustainable path to a just peace is one that is negotiated with the full and active participation of Ukraine and its key European partners, based on the established principles of international law, not one that is contingent on the outcome of personal negotiation between two powerful leaders. They fear that President Trump's all-or-nothing approach could easily fracture the transatlantic alliance and inadvertently end up rewarding President Putin's aggression, even if a small parcel of land is ultimately returned to Ukraine. The Kremlin's public response has been, as expected, curt and dismissive. Russian officials have simply reiterated their long-standing position that the status of the new territories is final and not subject to discussion. They have attempted to portray Trump's statement as empty political rhetoric intended primarily for an American domestic audience. Privately, however, Russian strategists and intelligence agencies are undoubtedly analyzing the statement with intense focus, trying to decipher its true meaning and intent. Does it signal a genuine and serious willingness from President Trump to engage in a substantive give-and-take negotiation? Or is it merely an audacious opening bid in what is expected to be a long and complex bargaining process? President Putin might well see this as a strategic opportunity. He could use the initial phase of the talk to probe President Trump's resolve and to ascertain exactly what the U.S. might be willing to offer in return for even minor territorial adjustment. He could, for instance, float the possibility of withdrawing from certain sparsely populated agricultural areas of the Kherson or Zaporizhia regions while holding on to the strategically vital land bridge to Crimea and the heavily industrialized heartland of the Donbas. He could then present this as a major peace gesture, a tactic designed to divide the Western alliance and to paint Ukraine as the unreasonable party if it were to refuse such a compromise. President Putin's strategy will almost certainly be to test for any weakness or daylight in President Trump's position and to see if he can trade strategically insignificant parcels of land for major geopolitical concessions. In the final analysis, President Donald Trump's promise to get Ukraine territory back from Russia has dramatically and single-handedly raised the stakes for the upcoming Alaska summit. He has boldly presented himself as the only world leader with the strength, skills, and vision to achieve what no one else has been able to, compelling a Russian retreat through the sheer force of his deal-making abilities. It is a promise that is perfectly in tune with his long-cultivated political brand as a master negotiator who can deliver a spectacular and unprecedented result. However, this audacious claim is built upon a precarious foundation of deep and perhaps irreconcilable contradictions. It attempts to satisfy the absolute demands of Ukraine while simultaneously ignoring the fundamental legal, political, and ideological realities that defines the Russian position. The success or failure of this high-wire diplomatic act will ultimately hinge on a single critical question. Is President Trump's unique and potent blend of threats and inducement powerful enough to force Vladimir Putin to make a concession that runs directly contrary to his entire political project and legacy? The meeting in Alaska will provide the first and most critical test of this extraordinary proposition. It will reveal to a watchful world whether Donald Trump's unshakable self-belief in his own negotiating genius can actually reshape the geopolitical map of Eastern Europe, or if it will be decisively shattered against the hard and brutal realities of a deeply entrenched and intractable conflict. Many of my listeners, like 70%, haven't subscribed to my YouTube channel, and so many of you don't even know that you haven't subscribed, and that is actually what makes the show going. It's almost like you're making a donation to the show. So that's why I ask again and again, because it enables us to grow and grow and grow. And we're going for the long haul here. And listen, if this is your first time listening to World Global Conflict, you don't have to subscribe. You guys, you're first ones on me. But if you have watched this show before, it's like you are a freeloader now. So all I would ask you is, if you have seen this show before and you like it, help me, help my team here. Hit that subscribe and like button now, and we will continue to build this show for you. That I swear. Thank you to all of you guys who have subscribed. It means a lot to me. Thank you so much. That's all for me for today. I will see you soon. Bye for now.